As a child, I would have considered myself a Christian. I grew up in a loving family with amazing parents, but we were never a church family. My exposure to the Christian way of life was limited, considering the only time we really went to church was on Easter sometimes. The gospel was never properly presented to me as far as I can recall, and faith was never really a foundation. This didn't seem to pose a problem until my early teenage years. My exposure to alternative beliefs mixed with my shallow faith and a little teenage angst sprinkled on top led to a rapid descent into how I would identify myself for the next decade. I proclaimed atheism, so much so that I knitted it into my personality. I would focus all my attention on the evil in the world, cursing at God for allowing such evil to exist in the first place. Along with these beliefs came the lifestyle. Without something other than myself to worship, I did exactly that. My only desire was to maximize all the worldly pleasures of the flesh, indulging in my sinful nature. Temptations became invitations that I would almost always accept. After years of continuous, unrepentant sin, I began to feel a deeper, underlying guilt for living this way. There was tension between how I presented myself to the world and the moral quandary I felt in doing so. For several years, I quietly struggled with this. I decided to give my best effort into investigating my own beliefs without ego and without bias. I began to find many of my closely held beliefs fell short of something bigger that I desired to connect with. In the midst of all this, I met a woman who, by the grace of God, somehow became my wife. She has been a Christian her entire life. Under the weight of much adversity, her faith has never crumbled. Her mother, who I became very close with over the course of our relationship, had been suffering for several years of ovarian cancer. In May of 2015, my mother-in-law passed away. The grief was extremely heavy. Moments after her last breath, I felt helpless. I was desperate for someone or something to give us peace of mind in the wake of such a tragic loss. As we sat in the room mourning, for the first time in my life and with total sincerity and genuine effort, I prayed quietly to myself. I prayed for the emotional strength of not only myself, but to my wife and my sisters. In that moment, I felt an emotional weight lifted from my body, like something had broken free from within my heart. From that day on, I disengaged from my previously held beliefs and began to entertain the belief of an eternal God. Fast forward a few years, my first son was born. I had never felt a love as deep as the love I have for my children. It's one of the purest forms of love one can attain. In those first few days, I began thinking about similarities in the Bible about how we are the children of God. This opened my eyes to the immense capacity of love that God must have for us. Then everything just sort of fell in place, and in that moment, the message of the gospel became an epiphany. Not only does God love us, but does so much so that in order to deliver us from sin, the same sin that I had shamefully spent so much time wallowing in, He sent us a Redeemer. That Redeemer being His perfect and sinless Son, to live the righteous life that the Father desires of all His children, and then to die in our place a sinner's death that we were destined for and deserved, only then to conquer that death in resurrection, ascending into eternal life. Had I continued my hedonistic lifestyle, I now realize that the penalty for this would have been eternal spiritual death. This is what unrepentant sin always leads to. I'm so incredibly grateful for such a gracious God to grant me the sight to see and the ears to hear. If He didn't, it's quite possible I'd still be living a life of sin. I could never pay the debt owed for that, but Jesus Christ could, and He did.